PSYOP, psychological operations. They exploit human emotions to achieve desired outcomes, usually by a small group of people. Your objective reasoning and belief system are short-circuited to radically alter your way of thinking. Two primary fears, the fear of death, the fear of poverty, break down your willpower to make you mentally weak and easy to change. Then, after creating a state of confusion, psychological techniques such as isolation, triggering, scarcity, information control, lack of knowledge, division, repetition, and, well, new language instill new belief systems to create desired behaviors, generally reserved for those by military, well, on foreign nations. But intelligence operators instruct those in power on how to apply these techniques to subvert, control, or change a population. The two primary fears used together with these techniques amplify effectiveness, causing something called trauma-based mind control. Unfortunately, most Canadians have been subjected to these types of techniques the last couple of years. There's no question about that, and no doubt in our minds. I've got a great interview and a great clip with expert Professor Mattais Desmet. He's a Belgian psychologist, and he was speaking at a hearing in the EU Parliament about what's going on here in Canada and around the world. I'd like you to watch this with open eyes, and I hope you take away everything that I've taken away just by watching.
My colleague, Dr. McCullough, just asked you not to fall prey to the false narratives in the corona crisis. And throughout the last 3 years, I tried to explain and describe why so many people did fall prey to all these false narratives, why in many respects it was clear that they were false narratives. So that was the focus of my work. I described what was going on in our society as a process of mass formation, which is a kind of a psychological group formation, which is happening in the beginning stages of the emergence of totalitarian states. Totalitarian states, which are often confused with so-called classical dictatorships. Many people think that a totalitarian state is a classical dictatorship, but it is something completely different. In a classical dictatorship, a small regime seizes control over society, usually through a demonstration of its aggressive potential. But the emergence of a totalitarian state happens in a completely different way. And we know the best, historically speaking, the best known examples of totalitarian states are the Soviet Union in the first half of the 20th century and Nazi Germany. What we are dealing with now, I think, is a completely different kind of totalitarianism. On the one hand different, on the other hand very similar. I'm afraid we are being confronted with the emergence of a so-called velvet glove totalitarian, technocratic totalitarianism, a kind of totalitarianism which is led by technical experts, which believe that they the only way to manage society is through rational knowledge. And so what we are going through now, I think, is the replacement of a democratic model by a technocratic model. A technocratic model which in the end will be as dangerous, I think, as the fascist and communist totalitarianism of the first half of the 20th century. So, what happens in the beginning stages of a totalitarian system at the psychological level is the emergence of what Hannah Arendt called in a very evocative way the diabolic pact between the elite and the masses. A substantial part of the elite, the leaders of society, and a substantial part of the population become fanatically convinced of a certain narrative, a certain ideology, a certain theory, become so fanatically convinced of it that they believe that it is their duty to impose it to society in a relentless way, transgressing all normal ethical boundaries. And we've seen this process happening not only in the first part of the 20th century, but we've seen it happening, we've seen it slowly emerging throughout the last, let's say, the last 2 centuries. Starting from the French Revolution onwards, we've seen how a new elite emerged, a new elite which seized control of society, or which tried to impose its will to society. Not in an overt way, as the ancient elite did, but in a much more covert way, through indoctrination and propaganda. Immediately after the French Revolution, as soon as the religious view on man and the world was replaced by our contemporary materialist view on man and the world, the elite couldn't impose its will anymore in an overt way, and they found a solution to that. They found a solution by imposing its will without the population knowing they were doing what the elite wanted. It was at that moment that modern propaganda was born, and throughout the last 2 centuries, propaganda became more and more and more important. Politicians, leaders, used more and more propaganda, manipulation of the population throughout the last 2 centuries. And now we are living, I think, in a public space which is constantly saturated by propaganda. And at the same time, and that's something extremely important, or I will add one more thing to the emergence of propaganda in the last 2 centuries. I think that the pandemic treaty and the amendments to the international health regulations that have been discussed here are just one huge step forward at the level of the use of propaganda to convince the population to accept the replacement of a democratic system by a technocratic system. So that's the one part of the story. The other part of the story is that the psychological state of the population changed throughout the last few centuries. The population became more and more atomized, to use a philosophical term, meaning that more and more people started to feel lonely, were confronted with lack of meaning-making, and experienced so-called free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression, which means a major part of the population got in this state, which made it extremely sensitive for indoctrination propaganda. And it is the combination of the two, the combination of a government or an elite, which believes that propaganda is the only way to keep control over society, and on the other hand, a population which is in a state in which it is extremely vulnerable to indoctrination propaganda, which gave rise to totalitarianism, to this pact between an elite who manipulates the population and a certain part of the population, the so-called masses or the crowds, which blindly believe the propaganda. That leads to this deadly mixture, which is called totalitarianism. So I think it's very important to realize, I think, for everyone, that a totalitarian system is a blind system. Even the people who go along with it, even the people who buy into the system, in the end, fall prey to it. Nobody is safe for a totalitarian system. And in the end, there is only one way, I think, only one way to stop the emergence of a totalitarian system. And it is by everyone who realizes that something is going wrong. To stop going along with the narrative and to start to speak out. Everyone who feels that there is something wrong, and there are many people, I believe in total something like 70% of the people feels that something is wrong with the narratives that now seize control of society. Well, it's time to start speaking out, I think. It's time to start telling that you feel that there is something wrong. Because otherwise, we will go to a state in which nobody can stop the system anymore, simply because it's not only an elite, that a cruel elite or an evil elite that mismanages the world. It's much more than that. It's a mass that is on the move. It's a blind societal system of which nobody is in control anymore. So that has always been my main message, and I continue to repeat it. It's important that we, each in our own way, speak out in public space, that we learn the art of what was once called truth speech, that we try to optimize it, to cultivate that art, and in this way, that we prevent the only real remedy for the problems we are facing now in a society. Thank you.
Well, unfortunately, most Canadians have been subjected to these types of techniques the last 2 years. Dr. Mattais Desmet, professor, Belgian psychologist, and a man who understands exactly what, well, the world is faced with. Remember, you're the voice, and it's time to make it count. I'm Brad Wilder. Thanks for watching Wake Up Canada News. Remember, you can find us on BitChute.com/Wake Up Canada News. We're also on Rumble under Wake Up Canada News. Remember to subscribe, like, share, and donate to help keep Canadians in the know now on news that is conservative. I'm Brad Wilder. We'll see you next time.